Hello. Am I? Hello. Am I? Oh, brilliant. Yeah, so I am actually here. Hang on, just let me fiddle around with this a little bit. Hi, my name is Dylan Lowe, and yeah, I'm going to be your host for the next hour and 15 minutes or so. Without further ado, welcome to my home kitchen. And everything's a little bit dysfunctional at the moment because me and my partner Sarah have actually just moved in here about 2 weeks ago, and we're still trying to figure out the entire space. It's a very different scenery with storage spaces and items, arrangements, and things like that. We even got the washing machine here that still hasn't been installed. And it's a complete change of scene for us, seeing that in our previous place we actually used it to do supper clubs, and we actually know it like the back of our hand. But right here, a couple of weeks in, we're still figuring out a way around and trying not to bump into things with our heads, and that's actually happened quite a few times, considering how tall I am. So just let me introduce myself. My name is Dylan Lowe. And I run a travel website called The Travelling Editor, and I am a travel and food writer and photographer, both on my website and on a freelance capacity. Also the other thing that I do is that I run, as I mentioned just now, supper clubs and pop-up restaurants. Sarah, my now wife, and I started off doing supper clubs at our own home on the other side of London that we used to live in up until about 2 weeks ago. We actually hosted people in the flat, paying customers who'd come in and have anything ranging from a 5-course menu to a sharing plates menu. To then we took it to the next level and decided to actually run pop-up restaurants in cafe spaces and places like that where they would be closed at night time. So we would rent a space and we would run our own sort of one night off restaurant in there. So as I mentioned, I'm based in London, and for those of you who are especially tuning in on the West Coast, you probably have just woken up and heard the news, and I just really want to quickly address the thing that happened last night. And from where I'm standing in this corner of London, everything's very quiet, everything's very tranquil. We're close to the suburbs now, so there's not a lot of activity, maybe some sirens in the background. But as far as me and Sarah are concerned, we didn't really head out into central London last night because on Saturday nights they do tend to give us a mild case of agoraphobia. But from what I can see, everything's settled. Everybody's going about their own lives, and the best thing to do is not to give in to the terror, and is actually to have business as usual, love as usual, and without going sounding too overbearingly political or anything like that. In a loveless society, that breeds apathy, and that breeds a general disregard for human lives, and I think that's something that we need to keep bearing in mind as we go along our daily lives. So, without this drudgery, I'm going to kickstart with the cooking process itself. So there's a whole list of food items, dishes that have been shared over through the grapevine with the Immersion Travel magazine and the Sustainable Travel Summit's website and the social media, and I'm sure a few of you probably received it via the email as well. And with certain dishes, I'm afraid that I won't actually be able to do, because entirely out of my own failing, I actually managed to, or not managed to source those key ingredients that I actually needed. So things like pandan leaf, which is an Asian staple, a very aromatic palm type leaf that is used in a lot of Southeast Asian cooking. I haven't actually managed to get that, and really unfortunately I've scoured several Oriental supermarkets throughout London and I still didn't manage to get that. So unfortunately I won't be able to make kaya jam, for instance. But what I can do is I can pass along the recipe through my social media accounts after this particular broadcast and maybe a little bit later on. Or, you know, if you guys would like, I can send it over to you individually. So just shoot me a tweet, or you know, actually just type in your request over on the live chat in the YouTube channel. That's live broadcasting right now. But what we will actually do are a whole range of dishes, and some of the dishes that I actually managed to think up yesterday when I went to one of the local markets just up the road. Once again, just actually having moved into this new area, I'm discovering all these, you know, just getting the lay of the land at the moment, finding all these local farmers markets where it's not just a weekly or, you know, once in a while sort of gathering of merchants and people like that, but also it's a fantastic place to source ingredients and get inspirations, and also allow me to remind myself a lot of flavours that I may have knocked to the back of my memory, and managed to reshuffle the entire database, the entire memory bank, and manage to have it resurface and actually turn into what I've got today. And also, what we've got going on is that when Sarah, my wife, and I moved to this place, we actually we sought out a particular property, or a particular type of property that comes with a decent sized back garden, because we actually want to get into urban farming. So we managed to turn, or in the process of turning our 12 by 8 metre backyard plus a little strip at the side, gradually into vegetable patches, and eventually we're going to make more vegetable patches and actually start growing a lot more of our own produce. And one of the things that to a lot of the fellow gardeners out there, or fellow vegetable growers out there who would know, one of the most upsetting process of gardening is thinning out. So when you actually sow all the seeds in one row, and you put in basically more seeds than eventually they'll grow into vegetables, you actually start pricking out the seedlings that you want to eliminate, because they're taking up way too much space for one individual plant or several individual plants to grow taller and bigger, and you know, and be more productive. So in this case, I actually managed to thin out some turnips this morning, actually, and I will probably show you a bit more of them, because these are turnip seedlings, and I'm absolutely delighted that I'm actually going to be showcasing these little morsels right here. These are just sort of seedlings of turnips, which I'll go into more depth later, but I'm actually going to be demonstrating how to eat this microgreen on this particular broadcast, and this being the first ever thing that we've actually harvested from this particular patch. So, you know, I'm very excited to do this, and we will get straight into it. So one of the things that I thought we would do first and foremost is bread making, and because it is one of the most time-consuming things, and as you might have gathered from a lot of live cooking demos in the past, and you know, I'm actually starting to notice that there is a bit of a backlight going on. I really do apologise for that. Hopefully I'll keep toddling the camera just to make sure that you can all see very clearly, or you know, relatively clearly anyway. And then yeah, so bread making, it is one of the most time-consuming things, and with a lot of live cooking demos, they probably would have prepared something in advance, so that we can skip the stages of having to wait for something to develop, or specifically in the case of bread making, the rising process, which obviously can take up to hours. So with focaccia, which is the very bread that I'm going to demonstrate, it's an incredibly easy bread to make. It's probably one of the easiest types of bread that you can make. and it's also one of the most flavoursome because you do put in a lot of herbs and spices into it. It's practically a blank canvas, essentially. I mean, to an extent that in certain parts of Italy, what is actually known as pizza is actually, in fact, focaccia, as we know it. I'll tell you more about the wonderful stories that I've encountered on my travels in Italy as I go along with showing you how to make this focaccia. And yeah, I'll just narrate as I go along. So let's try this. So this is the tabletop I've got, and as I can see, the lighting's so much better down here, so you'll be able to see things a lot more clearly. I've got a range of ingredients that I've prepared over there that I'm just going to be grabbing with my hand. So everything's within and it's always handy. Especially if you're cooking for quite a lot of people, or you're doing a lot of dishes and you have most of the things prepped before, you know, the sort of the final hour per se, and everything will be so much easier to you as you do all of your food cooking. Now, focaccia. It's as basic as bread gets, plus more, I would say. As basic as it gets because it goes with a foundation of flour, water, yeast. If you combine all three of them together, providing the yeast is still active and providing the water doesn't have too many contaminants and the flour is of good quality, the bread will rise and the bread will become a very fantastic tasting thing. Now, with focaccia, what essentially you have is flour, water and yeast, as you would as the holy trinity of bread making, but you also add more to it. It is essentially a blank canvas for developing more complex flavours and even flavours that you would normally not associate with the origin, the place where focaccia originates from, which is Italy. So what I've got here is that I've got some wholemeal flour, or whole wheat, as our friends in America would know it as. We've got some type 00 white flour, Italian way of milling flour, and the grains themselves are extremely fine. So this is the sort of thing that you would use normally to make pasta, but in this particular instance, just to keep it authentic per se, we're going to use this. We've also got some quick yeast just to get the whole thing rising and make it basically make bread as bread would be. Now, water is something else entirely. I will just demonstrate that as I go along. So, with bread making, quite a lot of times when I say consult recipes that are written by people on, you know, the American side of the Atlantic, sorry, they tend to give you quantities in cups. That is something that I sort of would discourage, I'd say, because in bread making, it would be a lot more favourable if you actually measure the flour in weight, not volume. The reason behind that is in bread making, they're quite often, as you reference the quantity of water you want to add in ratio with the flour, you actually cite it as a ratio as opposed to a measurement. And on top of the fact that you would be measuring the volume of water, which is more accurately measured in weight, because 1 milliliter of water is equivalent to 1 gram of water. If you measure both of these by a common measurement, a common weight measurement, then everything would be a lot more accurate in that sense. As opposed to in cups, you basically fill in one of your cup measurements, and quite often what you have with flour is that they sometimes come with different grain sizes. And when they come in different grain sizes, naturally when they pack together, they obviously fill up the cup in different rates. So you wouldn't be able to more accurately measure exactly how much flour you would be using. So in this case, I'm actually going to just do a half of the focaccia, because as per the ways of doing demonstrations live, I have already prepared a loaf of focaccia. It has been rising in this relatively warm kitchen for the last 4 or 5 hours. It's done 2 risings, in fact. I will actually show you the reason behind it. So with starting from scratch, I've got my balance here and I've got my mixing bowl here. I'm going to do, you would actually want to have 750 grams of flour altogether. And I'm going to start with the wholemeal, or whole wheat. Now I'm going to make a smaller dough in this case, so I'm going to just put the amount of flour that I'm going to use for this one, but for the sake of an actual measurement for a 750 gram flour focaccia, I would say use 250 grams of wholemeal. And then use 500 grams of type 00. And with the scale balance, I'm going to now put in 7 grams of yeast. Mix everything, all the dry ingredients together. And now, balancing, zeroing the scale again, I'm going to add some salt, because in this case, you're actually going for a more savoury dough, and you really need to have a little bit of salt to give it some flavour as a sort of foundation to it. I'm using Maldon sea salt. Any type of sea salt would be great. Large pieces would be better. I would add 5 grams of sea salt. And I've got that over there, and I'll put everything in the mixing bowl where I'm going to mix all the dry ingredients together, just like that, so that everything's stirred through. Now, there are some flavourings that you can add along the way. The drier ingredients, the drier flavouring. So some of my favourite flavourings for this particular type of bread would be fennel seeds, coriander seeds. Sometimes I do caraway seeds, and celery seeds actually do really well as well. Just put about roughly 5 grams of it in there. Maybe a little bit less if you're doing a mixture of different spices, so that you actually have a good conspicuous flavour that's going to come out of the bread without being drowned out by the baking process itself and the rest of the flavours of the bread and the oil that we're going to be adding later as well. So in this case, I'm going to be going with some of the sort of all-time favourites of focaccia making, which is thyme and rosemary. In this case, in this specific case, I'm just going to use thyme. Now, it's always very handy, by the way, when you're cooking, that you actually take one of these plastic, grocery containers and actually use that to collect any rubbish or any discarded pieces. So the stems of the thyme, for instance, would be good to sort of just chuck in there, especially if you do collect your compost and you compost yourself. So I'm just going to add a little bit, and because I'm actually using a smaller quantity just to demonstrate the kneading process, because I would love to show some of you who haven't really had a hand in kneading how to do this. So I'm just putting a little bit. Now, remember what I said about the ratio of flour and water is reported to be the standard way of measuring for more professional bakers. So instead of actually having the flour in volume and the water, the flour in weight and the water in weight, what you would do is the ratio of water and flour by percentage. So what I've got here is 750 grams of flour and everything mixed together. If you going to sight it at 750 grams of flour, you want roughly about 66 to 70% of water, of the equivalent of its weight. So in this case, I'm going to go for about 525 grams of water. Actually, did something incredibly silly there. Always measure the water. So zero that in. So 1/6. And I've got the water. So I've got a smaller portion of water here with a smaller portion of the bread. Now gradually pour it into the center of the bowl. You might have seen a lot of tricks and what have yous of basically making a little flour volcano and then stirring the water in and then use the fork. That is more naturally applied to pasta, but with bread making, everything just gets stirred together anyway in a bowl, and it's easy to contain that. So you can just pour all the water in as you go along, and then now all you do is just trying to mix it up with your hand. As I always do, something that my dad has actually not so much as taught me, but hinted several times when he's done cooking with me. It's always handy to actually have one hand that is clean and the other hand is sort of in the mix per se. So I always sort of just keep one hand to the rim of the bowl and the other hand doing the mixing all by itself. Even though that might be a little bit more exhausting, at least you won't be having a little panic when you need to have a spare clean hand to do some other things, or actually having a hand that's going to stabilize. Stabilization in kneading bread inside a container is very important because it can get rather rigorous. So essentially, bind everything together so that you've got a dough formed like this, and then take it out. We're going to reserve that for a little bit later because we're going to use that to rise. Now I'm going to move my chopping board here for a second because I'm going to use this space down here. So with a clean tabletop, just roll it around like that and use the back of your hand to push it down like that, and always pushing down and stretching forwards. Now if your two hands can work in tandem and they are both very dexterous per se, then one good system with kneading all sorts of breads, especially the ones that are a little bit less sticky like this one, is that you use one hand to push it and the other hand would fold it back like that. So just let me show that to you in slow motion again. You push that forwards, you take the hand off, and you basically comb all of this back, and revealing also in the same time the other side of the bread that needs kneading. Now that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it, which I do like mixing things up a little bit, is just sort of do this alternate knead. By the end of the day, it is really good exercise, and as you can see, it's getting quite rigorous when the laptop is itself trembling. So the other way of doing this whole kneading process actually is what one of my favourite baker slash cookbook author, Andrew Whitley, actually called the air kneading. So what you actually do, and it is in itself a very good way to know if a dough is actually ready, is when you take this up and actually stretch it with your hand and go as far as you can go without breaking, fold it back again, and then twist to the other side that hasn't been stretched out, and then stretch again, and then fold it, stretch out. See, this is actually, when it breaks apart like that, that means that it hasn't quite developed the gluten structure. So you can air knead a couple of more times just to give it a little bit more traction. And if it still is a little bit brittle, as brittle as it would be, go back to the drawing board or go back to the kneading board. As you can see, I'm sort of doing multiple things at the same time. I'm just trying to constantly test the elasticity of that dough. Now, normally a kneading process like this could take up to about 10 minutes. Because I'm working with a smaller demo dough, I can actually do this in about 5 minutes or 3, depending on how this goes. But I can tell you a little story about the whole focaccia that I've encountered on my travels. So, the focaccia itself as a bread is something that I've encountered in a lot of Italian communities with the different toppings, either introduced during the baking process or after the baking process. But one of the things that really, sort of as a story, as an encounter, that really struck me was when I was in the southern Italian region of Puglia, when I was there on an assignment to document the actual area of the region of Salento, and I visited one of the village community bakery where they have one big wood-fired oven within the establishment itself, and how it functions is that you can any household in the village can bring in their own dough. Any household that doesn't have their own oven can knead their own dough at home, let it rise, get it ready, and then place it on a tray and just either walk or drive to the local bakery, and they can just stick it in the oven and bake it. And it's something that I've actually encountered as well in Morocco, where they have something very similar within the Medina and within the back alleys, the residential areas of Marrakesh and the likes, where people still knead their own bread, they still rise their own bread, and then when the time comes where they have to bake it, they just sort of bring it to one of the local bakeries and use their community oven to do the trick. And for me, that is just an absolutely fantastic idea and a fantastic concept that is sadly phasing out of the convenience of human civilization nowadays, where everybody can buy an electric oven, but even though not everybody can build a traditional wood-fired oven, which has its characteristic smoky flavour of burnt wood and the smokiness from essentially being in a clay-baked oven that's seen quite a bit of baking history, I'd say, and there's something to lament there. So I've got a dough that's ready here, and like I said, this is a miniaturized version of what the overall focaccia would be. So just let me remind you, it's 750 grams of flour altogether, 500 of type 00 pasta flour, and 250 wholemeal flour, just to give it a nice balance and some flavour and texture. And then I mixed in about 5 to 7 grams of salt and 7 grams of fast-acting quick yeast. And then I put in around 66 to 70% water. So in the case of the overall dough, that's 525 grams, which is 525 millilitres, coincidentally, of course. And this is the finished dough. Now, as with focaccia, what you would actually do normally is you would also incorporate olive oil, just to give it that extra sort of moisture, that extra flavour. What I did mention in the ingredients list is that what I'm going to do is I'm going to use wild garlic oil. Now, this is kind of like my little, British spring twist to it. The can itself is in Hungarian, and is actually a friend of mine from Hungary. Never been to Hungary, but I do revere their paprika, and a friend of mine actually brought back some chili paste that they produced in her hometown. So I've actually kept the jar. But what actually is in there is something a lot greener. It is wild garlic in oil itself, which is preserved. So what I've gotten is some wild garlic from my local food market, where they basically just produced a whole last batch of wild garlic for the entire season. So we're not going to see any fresh wild garlic probably until maybe March or April next year in the UK. And it's, as opposed to just cooking it, what I did was preserve that in oil. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just take about a tablespoon of this, miniaturized size as well. I'm going to use half of that. Take take 1 tablespoon of wild garlic oil and add it in, and then take 1 tablespoon of normal olive oil and put that in. And by the way, just sort of for the sake of reference, and I would be remiss to mention that, but with the wild garlic oil, all I did was actually just infusing some wild garlic with olive oil. So I chopped up the wild garlic leaves, dosed it with a bit of salt, just to salt them and release some of the liquid and the flavours. And then I put the olive oil with it, and then I put them in a jar, and that's about it. That's the entire process. So what you do now is work the oil into the dough by just sort of rubbing on the surface, and then fold it again like that, and then constantly using your thumbs pinch around the dough to get everything as centered as possible, so that you're starting to feel that the oil has been distributed around it. And then eventually just round up the spear, put it back in the bowl. And then all you do now is put it in a relatively warm place. Pop a tea towel on it. Just leave it to rise for about an hour, first initial stage. Now the second rise that I mentioned earlier is when that has risen for about an hour, it's expanded exponentially in volume. And then essentially what you do then is to take that out and put that in the container where it's going to be baked in. And then you essentially leave it alone again for about 2 hours to rise again, this time actually rising according to the actual container itself. A lot of people use a little bigger baking trays, but I actually prefer to use a cake tin because it's got a bit of depth because it is itself not very wide, and so it allows it to rise a bit more, so it has a bit more volume as well. So there's nothing quite like eating a very thin piece of focaccia when you only just get a sort of tiny, strip yay high, when you can actually make a focaccia that's sort of a little bit taller than that, and then actually give you a better sandwich as well on the side as opposed to in the middle. So what I've got here is the cake tin with the focaccia in it. So what I actually need to do now is, as focaccias are, dimple them. It would be blasphemous if I don't do that. So just going to let the sides drop down a little bit. It has actually risen a little bit. It has actually been rising for a little bit too long. That's the only problem. And so it's actually starting to deflate a little bit. So I think now it's definitely time to put it in the oven. So I'm going to give it a few pokes like that. Always work from the center. Now you can see that the top has actually gotten quite dry as well, so which is why actually now would be a good time to give it another dose of olive oil. Now the better thing to do about it is actually to put olive oil with a little bit of water or, as I mentioned in the ingredients list, some white wine. So stir it together with the fork, just blend it together as you would with an egg with a fork, and then once you've emulsified the oil with the water or with the olive oil, just brush it on top. And in this case, because I actually used this brush earlier to oil the tin, which is also a very important step, I'm just going to wet my brush a bit and then just use the residue oil that's in the brush to give it a gloss. Now that in itself is going to give it a nice sheen on top, but it also makes sure that this bread isn't going to dry out as it is in the oven for a decent amount of time. So I'm going to put this in the oven right now, and by the end of this broadcast we'll be able to see how it goes. So at least we can get that out of the way. Popping into the oven. Set it to a relatively high temperature. I've got the oven on 220 degrees Celsius, and in Fahrenheit, if I can just get this converter going, it is going to be 430 Fahrenheit. So you can actually do that accordingly. Now, the next things I'm going to work on is going to be the potato hash. Now, potato hash, as we all know, is a breakfast staple, it's a lunch staple, it's a dinner staple. I mean, I've had hash in all three occasions, really. And it's definitely a thing that I've encountered a lot. Actually, not particularly so in the UK. I mean, it is a very popular breakfast item or brunch item, but I don't see it very often. In Sweden, however, I do actually encounter that quite a lot, and even in places like the Philippines, there is definitely an American influence somewhere in there, and a sort of, I probably won't even go too far back into sort of things like island cultures and cargo shipping, and basically islanders waiting for deliveries of corned beef and items like that in times when there's scarcity in food, around the time of the World Wars. But in this case, I'm just going to demonstrate how to make this potato taste absolutely fantastic, with a little help with a particular ingredient called gochujang. And as a lot of people know, it is itself a Korean chili paste, but I think that particular title is a little bit of a misnomer. What it actually really is a Korean fermented bean paste infused with hot peppers, and I definitely think that is more of a more as an apt description of it. It's basically just like it tastes a bit like sort of a spicy version of the Korean fermented bean paste, or Korean miso paste, as we would know from the Japanese equivalent. So in this case, it's got tons of umami in it, and it's got that kick to it that I think really would lift this up. So with the potatoes, I'm going to demonstrate very quickly how to just put this into the right size. That could be the optimum for frying this particular thing. I've actually got half a potato there. I've actually, once again, as per live demo, I've done most of the prep already. I've already boiled some potato to a certain point, around 10 minutes, nothing more, so that it doesn't break down during the second cooking process, nor is it too raw to be. So if you go for around 1 centimeter cubes, I find tend to be the best way of having them. Now you just sort of do on one side, flip it back over, as if you're reassembling the entire thing back together. Cut once again, and then just dice it like that. Then you basically end up with relatively equal sized cubes, and it's very important actually from the perspective of food science, because then when it goes into the boiling water, they roughly cook at the same rate, so they actually none of the cubes will end up just overcooked or undercooked, except for the small pieces, which will just crisp up anyway. So this is that. And then what I'm actually going to do now is introduce you to the hob section. I've got this pan right nice and hot over here, so hot that the handle actually is a little bit scorching. One thing that I have learned about hash, never underestimate the amount of oil that you need, because a lot of it is going to get absorbed by the potatoes and you're going to end up with just a really dry pan, and the whole thing is definitely going to start burning. Go for a relatively non-stick pan, decent sized, and you've got the you've got the potatoes here that I've already pre-boiled. I'm going to stick them in. Now, don't forget to season it as well as you go along, because what essentially salting actually does, so especially vegetables of high water content, is that it actually draws out the moisture, so then that accelerates the whole process of making them crispier. You've got that fantastic sound of potato just crisping up in there. Absolutely wonderful. And then I'm going to put a little bit of butter in there. Always find that adding butter after the potatoes in and just allowing it to melt slowly into them is the best way to do it, as opposed to just putting it straight into the pan and they brown and they get burnt. And the temperature that potatoes have to cook at, that really does happen quite regularly if you put the butter straight in. Now, whilst this is searing, I'm going to now prepare the gochujang. Now, with this particular glaze, I'm going to start with roughly a tablespoon of gochujang. I'm going to take a little container here. Depending on your preference, I mean, some of you probably love your heat, some of you probably don't. But a teaspoon or half a teaspoon normally does the trick, and it's itself quite flavoursome, so do watch out. Now, as you can see, it is itself quite viscous, so what you need to do is actually get some sort of, we need something in liquid form to thin it down a bit. Soy sauce, of course, that's one of the best options out there, because it adds another umami. It's got its own saltiness and sweetness, so add about a full teaspoon of it in there, and then gradually just stir it until it's mostly dissolved, broken into smaller clumps at least. Now, gochujang itself, as a Korean staple, it's something that I oddly didn't encounter when I was in Korea. Now then, when I was in Korea, that was when I was around 10 years old, and that was when I used to live in Hong Kong as I was growing up. And back then, I don't think I would quite have the sort of the palatal acuteness that I'd probably do now. Now that my taste buds are a bit more developed, and my memories, according to taste buds, are actually, you know, a little bit more recollectible. And don't forget to occasionally stir that so that it starts charring in on all the surfaces. Now, dissolve the gochujang into the soy sauce, and then what I'm going to do now, while saving the same spoon, take around half a teaspoon of honey, put it in there, and do exactly the same as before, dissolve it into that liquid. You want it to be a little bit viscous, a little bit sticky, but also at the same time you kind of do want it relatively runny, because then, as I will show you later, will be much better as a glaze cling to the surface of the potatoes whilst they're at the height of their crispiness. So, as I was saying, I actually didn't really discover gochujang as a Korean staple or as a really important ingredient in my life until when I started living in, when my parents started living in New Zealand, and I started making relatively regular visits over there. And they do have a very relatively large population of Korean immigrants, expats, people who have actually ended up in the bigger cities like Auckland and Wellington, and they've actually opened up a lot of very rather authentic restaurants that are most certainly catered for the local Korean communities. And everything that they cook is ultra flavoursome, ultra spicy. Everything is robust as per the Korean culinary way. And that's the one time when I actually fell in love with it. So essentially, sometimes the ingredients or the cuisines that you fall in love with, you don't essentially just encounter them when you get to where they're from. Quite often, the excuse me, gochujang gave me a kick. The ingredients, the cooking techniques, and the cuisines themselves quite often travel with people, and that's essentially one of the most beautiful things about travel itself. Is that travel doesn't just happen as somebody who consumes or anybody like that. It doesn't just, you don't just travel to another place to enjoy the food. Sometimes the food itself travel. It piggybacks on people, and they get brought to other places, other horizons, where people introduce whole new communities of people who have not travelled themselves. The cuisine itself has travelled. The chef and the ingredients have travelled with trade, with new opportunities around the world, and they get introduced to communities that would have no affiliation with the original cuisine or original ingredients whatsoever, and it then takes hold. And quite sometimes it's actually that sort of second-hand, per se, education and introduction to a cuisine that gets you, as opposed to you actually visiting the place. I mean, chances are, for a lot of people going to Korea and just looking at all the menus that are, largely in pictograms in bold Korean characters, probably won't do anything to you, because you wouldn't understand what you were ordering or what you're tasting, as opposed to actually having those cuisines introduced to you in your more familiar setting. They actually have more of an impact to you, and they certainly resonate a bit more when you're trying to recollect all these different culinary influences that you've encountered in your life. And I find that certainly a most wonderful thing, how food itself travel. It's not just people that travel. Now, the potatoes have been cooking away, and I certainly think that will need a little bit more time, because they are starting to crisp up. They're not quite there. In order for this particular, I would say the optimal way of doing potato hash, you really want to get it very crispy. You want to get it golden brown. You're going to get a very nice surface on top in order for the glaze to work, because what happens is that when the glaze hits the potato, it's liquid, so it's actually going to completely destroy all that work that you've done trying to caramelize, trying to crisp up the surfaces of the potato. So what you need to do is, when you add this, you have to do it very rather quickly. Pour it all in, let it caramelize, let it cling onto the surfaces of the potatoes, then quickly take it out the stove and serve it right away. That's exactly the best way to do it. Looking at the time, I'm just seeing that I've only got so much time left, because I rambled on for a while. What I've also got are these mushrooms. And it's something that I picked up the last time I was in Hong Kong, and there wasn't any restaurant that I went to, but it was actually my very rather clever granddad who made this dish as one of the things that we had for dinner. And he was especially accommodating to my wife Sarah, who is vegetarian, not by choice, unfortunately. She is allergic to meat and seafood. So he actually did it with Philadelphia, the cream cheese. Filled it in the middle, And for those of us who are not vegetarian, he actually used mussels. Now, I just found that an extremely fascinating way of doing it, when he actually took these little morsels of mussels, chopped them up, mixed them with Philadelphia and some parsley, put it straight in the oven, and baked it. It's fantastically tasty. So I'm going to do something in tribute of that. So I'm going to take little mussels out. Also, whilst keeping an eye on the potato hash, because they could burn any minute. Taking them all out of their shells. So, as you could imagine, probably, I've pre-cooked them before, actually. I just wanted to keep the purest flavour, so I actually did nothing more than just add some olive oil in a pan, put the mussels in, and just add water to steam it and put the lid on. Now with these, I'm just going to very roughly chop up into smaller pieces. Might actually not be the most visually appealing thing, but sometimes that's what food is. It's about appealing in the aftermath. So I've chopped that all up. Now with a good old Philadelphia cheese, I'm going to take that. I'm just going to add around a big heap teaspoon in there, or maybe two. Now I did actually reserve some of the liquid from cooking the mussels, so it's already got a little bit of moisture in there. So I'm just going to stir all that together into like a filling. It's surprisingly tasty, and mussels, as all shellfish like oysters and things like that, they contain a host, a wealth of minerals that are exceptionally good for your body. So there's nothing quite like starting your day with something as nutritious. It's definitely one thing that is incredibly easy to make. You can do filling up a mushroom. Got that. Salt, just a little pinch. Pepper. Taking care of other things that you've got cooking. Perhaps increasing the temperature a little bit more. Now, the other thing that I would hate to not add is some nice parsley leaves. You very quickly chop up. Add it straight in there. Give it a good old mix. Give it a taste. Yeah, it's got a saltiness, it's got that minerality about it. Now, as you might have seen, I actually took out the stem out of the mushroom earlier. Why waste it? Chop it up, mince it a little bit, adds volume. Once you've done that, take the mushroom and then just fill it all the way. As far as you can fill it. Excuse me. I'm going to take that griddle even, pop that on. I'm going to stick it in the oven for around 15 minutes. Before finishing off. So what I'm actually to mention is that I've actually set out a plate over there, and I think it will be the challenge. And sometimes I actually run very much over time with some of my food prep. Is one of my bad habits really. So I've sort of set myself a challenge to fill up this plate with different food items. So just to kind of craft the ultimate brunch platter. And over there, I'm going to show you another dish that I've actually prepared way in advance in just a moment. Now, the next thing I'm going to make is a nice little omelette. Now, this particular omelette, it actually folds in a lot of different influences, a lot of different ideas really. It's kind of like a folded egg piece as opposed to, you know, just a scrambled omelette with lots of different ingredients in it. It's sort of almost like a parcel really. One of the things that really inspired me about Japanese cuisine, which once again I haven't actually had the chance to go to Japan to actually have a good experience of all the culinary offerings they have. But having lived in Asia and having spent so much time over there and having actually encountered all those places that's got a very deeply permeated Japanese culinary scene, one of the things that really stuck out for me, and it's a very incredibly easy thing to do, is omelette rice. Now essentially you just make a rice, sort of like a fried rice with onions, garlic, mushrooms, different things like that. With tomato ketchup and maybe even a special sauce that, you know, that's been passed down for generations. You stir it all together, you put it into an egg wrap, and then you wrap the entire rice up with this egg, and it becomes the egg omelette. The omelette rice. What I'm actually going to do now, I actually had omelette rice for dinner last night, so I'm going to try to do something a little bit different. I'm going to create something that is like a tortilla, which is in the Spanish sense, as opposed to the Latin American sense, a omelette with potatoes inside. But I'm not going to have the potato. I'm just going to have some chorizo, chilled sausage, that I'm going to chop up into smaller pieces right now. It's easy to do that. I actually did take this out a few hours too early, so it's kind of gotten a little bit glossy. But now I'm just going to dice it up into smaller pieces. It is, of course, in itself cured with a lot of nice Spanish paprika or pimentón. I would say that Spanish cuisine is probably one of my biggest influences with my cooking. As a lot of people would tell you, more so not just because of their ingredients or, you know, the way of eating and the diversity, or even the biodiversity that is generating all those fantastic ingredients in all parts of Spain, but also the diversity of its culinary history. Now you've got places like the north where it's actually the cuisine's very much stayed localised. It's very much been where they can actually produce from the land and the sea they have. But then you've got areas like Andalusia, which is the southern part, where you've got the Moors who actually conquered and occupied that area for centuries, and they brought in a lot of the spices that were not available to the Europeans until centuries later. They brought in strong spices. They brought in things like saffron. They brought in cumin, turmeric, coriander, and they very heavily flavoured their food. And as it got passed down, it just sort of becomes the essence of Spanish food as we know it. And the other part of it is a lot of the ingredients actually came from the New World. Spain and Portugal being two the primary, the first pioneers in discovering the New World, and, you know, maybe the not so pleasant part, the conquering bit, but it also brought back a lot of things like potatoes and tomatoes, peppers that we nowadays take for granted so much, but we don't stop for a minute and appreciate the fact that in Europe we didn't actually have any of those things until about 500–600 years ago, and it was entirely not native over here. So, and now it's been so ingrained into a particular cuisine where tomatoes just seems to be so ubiquitous within the Spanish cuisine that you cannot simply have, there is no way you can tolerate its absence. It's such a testament to how far ingredients can travel and become so incorporated into a particular way of eating, not even cuisine, a way of eating. So I'm going to go back to the hash very quickly because it's now starting to get a little bit brown. It's starting to get that very nice colour on top. So as I mentioned to you, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that glaze, I'm going to give it a swirl, I'm going to drizzle it all over. It's going to sizzle very quickly. Once that around, that's it. It simply cannot go back onto the stove. Otherwise it's going to start getting very, very soft. So I've got the hash here. So first thing on the plate would be the backbone. Now I'm going to give that pan a very quick gloss over some water, just to flush off anything I don't want. Now, with this egg omelette, what I'm also going to use as a sort of tribute to omelette rice is a particular Japanese mustard green called komatsuna, and it's a very fast-growing variety. It's got this nice mustardy taste, but it's also it's got this sort of long stem that is very crunchy, so it actually works ridiculously well. So I'm actually going to, in order to save space, put the chorizo in there because I'm going to put everything all in one pan. Now with this, I need to make sure that the pan is very well oiled so that the omelette doesn't stick, or the egg doesn't stick. What I've got is 3 eggs. You need to add a little bit of extra water in there. Oops, sorry about that. In order to make it stretch. So what I'm going to do is, going also in line with the Japanese way of doing things, I'm going to add a little bit of mirin. Mirin is a type of Japanese cooking sake, and it's got that sweet sake flavour to it. That is going to add in the much needed sugar. That's going to help caramelize the entire thing. But if you don't happen to have mirin, a little bit of sugar, just a tiny bit of sugar, and a little bit of extra water will definitely do the trick. Add a little bit of water. A nice fluidy consistency, so just to make sure that it's going to spread around the pan as opposed to being too thick. What you really ideally want is a very nice thin film of it. I'm going to add a little bit of salt into that, a little bit of pepper. I don't really have a lot of time left, so I better speed things up. Yep, just taste it a little bit, make sure that it's got a bit of sweetness because the sugar is going to be very important in caramelising that a little bit. Give it a head start. So, butter right in. Now I'm not going to pour all the eggs in because one thing for sure, I'm the sort of kind of guy who likes my eggs runny. So it's always nice to expect a nice sort of a gooey centre when it comes down to eating everything from tortillas to an omelette. So I'm going to pour most of it in. going to reserve just a little bit. I'll show you why. Now very quickly, a little crust is going to start developing. I don't know if I can show you this. I'm going to try. You want to keep swirling it until you've got a very nice film of solid egg has developed. And because you're working with relatively medium heat at the moment, because you certainly don't want your egg to cook way too quickly, it's going to remain a bit runny. But make sure you sort of swirl the pan once in a while, just to make sure that it's actually not stuck to the pan, because it's very important for the next stage to have it not stuck to the pan. Sorry, I just keep doing that. Okay, let's see if the laptop is going to. Right. Now, whilst it's still a little bit runny in the middle, add your fillings. So I'm just going to pop them all in here. Should be a very nice little parcel by the end of this. So with the Komatsuna, I've actually used some of the younger leaves because they're a bit more tender than the older ones and they have less stalk. Some stalk would be nice to give it a crunch, but because you're not really cooking any of the veg, it's not going to taste too great if you have too many of the older leaves. So, as you remember, I actually have some of the spare egg. Now I'm actually just going to pour it all over this, all over the things that I've put on top, just to give it that nice runniness to it. Now, with fan spatula or anything that could be handy to you, you just need to keep testing to see if the egg has actually cooked. Now, the only problem with this particular pan is that it's actually a little bit concave, so certain areas of it don't cook as quickly and efficiently as the others. It's no good. Just seeing if I can actually. Nope, it's too brittle. Actually, in fact, this side is not ready. So this is a constant try and error stage where you actually just keep testing the strength, and when you think it's ready, fold it over like that, and you've got one side. You can give yourself one clap now. You've got 3 more left to go, and then second part, side over there. And then another flap from there. Hopefully this is going to work. Yep, no. Here we go. And then lastly, that final flap is going to be the trickiest, because we don't know if it's going to allow you to fold. Here we go. Not allowing you to fold because it's still too runny. But that's okay. I mean, it may look a little bit defeated, but once you flip it around, you're not going to be able to see anything. So, and the other side's going to come up nice and glossy. And then now, try to put this on here slowly, slowly, slowly. There we go. Didn't turn out so badly, did it? And then let it cool a little bit, and you can always adjust it. Just by using the spatula, or when it's cooled down even more, you can always just do it with your hand. Now let's check on the mushroom and see how we've done. It's got a nice charred, crisp top, but we want to make it even crispier. So what we're going to do is we're going to get some breadcrumbs, panko breadcrumbs if you can get them, better still. And we're just going to sprinkle that on top. Sorry. Just like that. I'll be back in for another 3 minutes. Not too long, otherwise it's going to char. And we really don't want that after all the effort we've put into it. Now, what happened to that thing that I told you about us harvesting some new greens? So, like I said, these are turnips, and actually more specifically, these are turnip tops. And this particular species is actually, this particular variety actually is called Cima da Rapa, which hails from the south of Italy, once again in the region of Puglia. And after spending so much time over there and with the assignments, I actually became very good friends with the people who work at the tourist board, and some of them very kindly brought over the seeds. Now these are what you would have as the greens that are actually on top of the turnips, as opposed to eating the turnips. So there are a lot of different varieties that do just that. You know, you've got the turnip tops, and you know, you've got some strains of carrots where you actually gather more of the leaves, the greens, as opposed to the root itself, because it's designed to be eaten. You know, beetroot and chard, for instance, is exactly that sort of relationship. And even the reverse applies. So we actually got some parsley root that is currently growing in the backyard. So we're actually harvesting the roots of the parsley, which turns into a tuber like carrots, as opposed to the abundance of leaves that are more fragrant. So what we've got here are these turnip tops, the Cima da Rapa, and I've thinned a lot of them out, and it would be a sad, it would be an absolute tragedy, a travesty to just chuck it away or even just compost it. And they're perfectly tasty. They taste, you know, like a little bit of mustard, a bit of mustard flavour, and that's because they, you know, both a lot of the mustard we know as rape, very unfortunate name, no coincidence with the rather immoral action. Rape and turnips actually belong in the same species. They're both Brassica napus, if I actually remember that correctly. So they both have that mustardy flavour, and when turnip tops have become mature, they actually become quite, you know, bittersweet actually. So this hasn't quite developed that bitterness yet, but what I'm actually going to do is dress them up as a salad. And the way how people in Puglia does it, they actually put it in a pasta, a ear-shaped pasta called orecchiette, and they cook it with a little bit of oil that's infused with garlic, fried garlic. Now, because these are microgreens, they're way too delicate to be overpowered by you know, the strong, robust flavours of burnt garlic. So what I've actually done instead is I put in a little bit of olive oil in a ramekin, and inside I've actually put a garlic that I've confied in the oven very slowly at 120 degrees. I'm not sure about that in Fahrenheit, maybe immersion can help us out. And that introduces a delicate garlic flavour to it. So I'm going to just drizzle a little bit of that on top. Not too much. That confit garlic could easily be used somewhere else. You can mince it into something, or you can you know, just drop it into a stew or something like that, and it will release that very nice, milder flavour of garlic. So I've actually given it a nice drizzle, as per you would in a good salad. So you've got a little bit of greens. I'm going to drop it straight in here. So that's an item done. So that's 3. Let's see, we've got number 4 coming out. Number 4 is here. Mushroom, nicely out of the oven. So I'm just going to take that with my fan spatula very gently, because it's still going to be quite hot. It might spill over any time, like that. Pop it over here, because I think we still have some more space on this plate. But just one last thing. Courgette flowers. They've just come into season and they're absolutely beautiful. They could be eaten fried, or, you know, in this case, I think I'm just going to have them raw. You know, it would be a travesty if you don't actually incorporate some of the courgette flavours back into it. So I'll show you what to do. First step, always remember to remove the stigma that is inside a flower. They create all sorts of, well, they have residues of bitter flavour that will create an image of you being a very amateur chef. If you don't remove that, people will judge you. I have been judged myself by Italians who, when I first had the experience of cooking with courgette flour, I absolutely and utterly embarrassed myself by not doing that, and ended up with these courgette flour fritters that tasted extremely bitter. So I've got one courgette flour here. I'm just going to open it up a little bit whilst being delicate and not rip them up. What I've actually got here are some caramelized onions mixed with the courgettes, the zucchinis, as some of you may call it. The little zucchini that comes with the flour, I've taken it off. I've cut them into smaller pieces and put them in there. And I mixed that with a little bit of butter and a little bit of corn flour, cornstarch, just to thicken them up a little bit. So I'm just going to fill this wrap up with this. Here's a sort of nice raw thing. Give it a twist like that. So then you've got a nice little wrap that's going to go on here as a garment and a complement to your big spread. Now, before we wrap up, let's do two things. One, let's check on that bread. It's been in the oven all this time. Must have done incredibly well. There you are. That bread's risen and it's gained colour. One good way, and actually I don't really recommend doing this straight away because it's still very hot, but I'm going to do it now anyway, is just to knock on it. And if it's got a very nice thud that sounds a little bit hollow on the inside, that means it's more or less done. So I think this is done. I don't think I've got time on this video to cut into it. I'd love to show you how it looks like on the inside, but sadly, I think we are going to finish soon. The other thing that I have been developing as well is this kind of noodle soup that I have been simmering in the pot since this morning, morning my time. To my surprise, some of the breakfast experiences I've had in the past, in Vietnam for instance, involved some really spicy noodle soups that I could barely swallow. I mean, there was this one shop that was recommended to me by some Vietnamese friends, who as it turned out, only opened between 4 AM and 9. So I woke up one day at 7 and I actually went to it, and I ordered one of those bowls. Bun Bo Hoi is what it's called. And yeah, nearly choked up and coughed up half of my throat, really. And ever since, though, hooked onto that stuff. My spice tolerance has gone completely off the charts ever since that trip. And yeah, and basically my palate had to thank it for it. And what I've actually done here is I've developed a spicy soup, kind of in tribute of a friend of mine, Jodie. Jodie from Legal Nomads, who spent quite a lot of time in Vietnam. I met with her quite a few times, and she's really into her soup, her noodle soup, when she's over there. And now she's spending a ridiculous amount of time in Mexico because she's fallen in love with the more gluten-free ways. She is a celiac of the corn tortillas and the way they do things over there. And she's spent time living in Oaxaca and actually started doing some food tours there. So what I've actually done here as a tribute to Miss Jodie Soup Girl is I've done a beef soup with some charred spring onions, garlic, and I've got some spices over here that I could just show you very quickly. And I've got, this is a cassia bark, some star anise, some coriander seeds, and lime, kaffir lime leaves. I stuck a decent amount of that in there, all to taste. And then what I did was I put in 3 different types of what is really known as the Mexican chilies. So you've got chipotle in there, I've got half a habanero, and I've also got some ancho chilies in there, just to give it a more complex flavour as it develops and as it boils very slowly. Do remove the seeds, do remove the peak, because they will be extremely spicy. I actually have managed to overspice this so much that it's getting to a level that is almost inedible. But I've kind of managed to tweak the flavourings a little bit, saved it, I hope. What I also did in there was I browned some beef short ribs with the bones on, so that as it cooks it develops the beefy flavour. And also I put in soy sauce and fish sauce, brown sugar, and I think that's about it. So it's actually a fantastic thing to have in the morning when you're feeling a little bit bold, and when you're also needing a kick to bring you back to the land of the living, especially when you've had a heavy night out or something. Now, it's actually rather silly of me not to have done that before, but I think I might just have enough time to actually simmer a little bit of noodles. Pop that straight in. Hot water. Doesn't need long. Just a couple of minutes to unbind it all together. Unbind it. I've also realised that, you know, all this time I didn't really get to check the live chat as I was cooking, and it's, you know, once again, actually I never really mentioned it, but I always find it a little bit difficult trying to cook, demonstrate, and chat to people at the same time, especially when, you know, I'm doing it on a live broadcast basis. So, you know, for any shortcomings of mine, I hope you can forgive me for this, and I really do hope that you've had a fantastic experience just at least seeing how a lot of these things are made. I don't know how much I've actually managed to demonstrate to you per se, and I don't know how much this would actually get into your, you know, recipe book, or you'll ever actually have a hand trying it at all. I hope you do, and if you need to ask me a bit more about what ingredients that I've used, you know, different techniques, ways of cooking, or just generally having a chat about culinary experiences and things like that, just drop me a line on Twitter at Travelling Editor, travelling with 1 L, editor, and I'll be happy to strike up a conversation with you. Now, I've just simmered these vermicelli noodles very quickly, as they would, in Vietnam. And then, it's very important in this, because you really do want to stop it from overcooking. So take all the noodles out of the pot, bash off most of the moisture, and it's what we call a cold river. Might stick your hand in there, it's going to maybe burn your fingertips, but, you know, it'll actually make things work better. And after you rinse it for a little while, it'll cool down quite quickly anyway. Now bounce off most of the excess moisture. And as a last demonstration, and if I can find space at all on my tabletop, because it's now getting a little bit overflowed, just right here, and sort of final tribute to all of you for tuning in. I'm going to grab a little bit more of that soup. Hopefully nothing too heavy. And then just drop that in. And of course, being the Asian way, always garnish it with a little bit of coriander. And I did mention that I put in some beef short ribs in there. Which has been simmering in the pot for so long. It's now a fantastic texture. So this is the entire brunch. I wish I have had more time to spend with you guys and actually showcase more of what I can cook up and things like that. But unfortunately we don't, and I'm going to have to pass the baton to the next person who will be speaking very shortly. So in the meantime, I will be speaking again later at a panel about how to find the best food when travelling. So hopefully I'll be able to see you then and continue the conversation. But in the meantime, it's goodbye from me, and I've got to go and pass the baton. So thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this. Once again, feel free to ask me anything over on Twitter if you have any questions about the food or just want to have a chinwag about culinary travel. So thank you so much again, and speak to you guys soon.